So welcome everyone to today's event with the title, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, a Challenge to the Mainstream Comparative Approach. My name is Mahdi Ghodsi, and I am an economist from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And we have the pleasure to host Bálint Magyar from Central European University Democracy Institute. And this presentation is based on a book with the title, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes. And the book is open access and can be downloaded for free from the author's website. And this event is part of the series of seminars in international economics that is organized by the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies in cooperation with Research Center International Economics, or FIW. And seminars in international economics are intended to be a forum for presentations and discussion of current research findings in the field of international economics, with a special focus on international trade, foreign direct investment, and migration. And to give you some housekeeping rules, the event usually has a presentation of about 30-40 minutes that is always followed by a discussion of about 20 minutes. And most important thing is that this session is being recorded, and hopefully next week we will upload it on the CEU YouTube channel so that anyone who could not attend today's seminar could also watch it later. And you have the opportunity to raise your questions and write it in the chat function. And if the question is very pressing and important, that helps the understanding of the discussion, I will raise the question, I will jump and unmute myself and ask the question. Otherwise, we will collect all the questions and comments in a moderated discussion after the presentation. And after the event finishes, we will also send you an online survey, and we would like your feedback and evaluation. Actually, this is our it's a great pleasure to conclude this year's seminars in international economics by this presentation by Bálint. Actually, we managed to successfully organize 16 seminars during 2021, and most of them have had at least about 20 participants from different countries and even different continents. And the slides of this webinar will be also available online on the website of the event. And in order to introduce Bálint, actually many of you may already know Bálint from his reputation and his resume. He's a sociologist and a liberal politician. He's an activist of the anti-communist dissident movement since 1979. And he was one of the founding members and leaders of the Hungarian Liberal Party. Former member of parliament, and he was also a minister of education. He is currently a fellow of the Central European University Democracy Institute, and his previous English language books include Post-Communist Mafia State, The Case of Hungary. So again, thank you very much, Bálint, for attending our webinar and presenting your excellent work. We are welcoming your good thoughts and expertise and insights, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. The book was written together with a young friend of mine about the typology, practical typology of post-communist regimes.
Okay.
During the regime change, we had an illusion. First, that the linear progress towards liberal democracies can definitely conclude the change of the regimes and to the transformation into liberal democracies. And the other type of illusion was that on the ruins of communist dictatorship, you can build any kind of regimes, even liberal democracies, if you enough smart to do that. At that time, practically we and the mainstream politologists and even politicians had the assumption that these regimes, after the regime change, they are on a transitional track and they will reach the status of liberal democracy sooner or later. But after a decade, the question was raised that those who stuck in a position between dictatorship and liberal democracies, it's just a transitional status or whether a terminal stations. And when they had to face this problem, then they tried to create new theories for describing these regimes, and the transitology was replaced by hybridology. Practically, the regimes which were called hybrid regimes, and there were a lot of naming and different typologies of these regimes, were placed somewhere between on an axis between liberal democracy and dictatorships. With my friend in our book, we followed the typology of János Kornai and some others who just differentiated between three ideal typical regime types, democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship. But both the transitology and the hybridology had the assumption that they examined the development of these regimes just through the investigation of political systems, political institutions, and they assumed that with the language which was used for the description of liberal democracies, they can characterize these regimes, the new regimes as well. We at the same time identified three such axioms, what we call hidden axioms, because the mainstream politology did not face them directly, and they used them and accepted them in an unconscious way. One of these assumptions is, the first one is that the separation of spheres of social actions, the political, the economic, and communal spheres, is completed. What was not the case historically. In some of the former communist countries, this separation historically did not occur at all. These spheres colluded or even were merged together. In some more Western societies formally, even where this separation was on its way, but was not totally completed. We could separate three, in quotation marks, I would say, three civilizational spheres of the communist regimes, of the post-communist regimes. First, which could be just labeled with the civilization of Western Christianity. The next one is with the Orthodox Christianity, and the third one, as we are going further to the east, in the in the former Soviet empire, not considering China. This was those where the Islam was in a ruling position. The second hidden assumption is that the de jure positions of persons and institutions definitely coincide, which is not the case. When in a mainstream Western politology, they are speaking about certain actors, like entrepreneurs, politicians, or certain institutions, they assume that their former position coincides with their de facto positions, and if there is something different, they consider this just a deviancy and not as a main rule to describe these regimes. And the third hidden assumption is that the state is definitely acts as a pursuer of common good and public good, and their public policy mistakes or corruption cases are not system constituting elements, but simple deviances. We dissolved these assumptions these so-called axioms, and we started our analysis on the base that what happens if we try to understand these post-communist regimes, that we do not accept to be valid these axioms for all post-communist regimes, but we think that what happens if these are not relevant for them, and it concluded to such a situation that we had to create a kind of new language for the description of these regimes. Therefore, we started to double all these basic ideotypical regime types. Democracy, we distinguish between liberal democracy and patronal democracy. In the case of autocracies, between conservative autocracy and patronal autocracy, and in the dictatorship, between communist dictatorship and market exploiting dictatorship. The question is that what makes valid this differentiation? So we took into consideration not just only the de jure status of political institutions on a democracy dictatorship axis, but we saw that whether an anti-patronal transformation happened in these regimes or not, after the regime change or as a result of regime changes after the 89 and 90 period with the collapse of these communist regimes. What is the basic difference between liberal democracy and patronal democracy? In the case of patronal democracy, while we are speaking about political parties, but the political parties fighting with each other, they are not political parties in a Western sense, but they are just covers or clauses of different competing and rivaling patron-client networks. What is the difference between a conservative autocracy and patronal autocracy is that while in a conservative autocracy there is a concentration of political power on the political level, but there does not occur weaselization of the society or transformation into patron-client networks, while in a patronal autocracy, we can see a single pyramid patron-client network, which rules practically and overrides all the formal institutions of the state. The difference between a patronal democracy and patronal autocracy, that in a patronal democracy, none of the patron-client networks are in the position to subordinate the rivaling patron-client networks to itself, and therefore there is a fragile equilibrium and permanent fight between different patron-client networks in the form of different political, in quotation marks, political parties. In a patronal autocracy, there is a single pyramid patronal network, but there are already not rivaling patron-client networks. If we make a short comparison between communist dictatorship and market exploiting dictatorship, communist dictatorship is characterized by one-party system and the monopoly of state ownership, while in a market exploiting dictatorship, which is close to the Chinese model, this ideal type, it means that you have a one-party system, political level, but on the other hand, the state ownership is not in a monopolistic position, but it lives together with different forms of private ownership as well. But then it's an important question that what does it mean?
Sorry, Bálint, one question was asked in the chat, and I think it's worth to ask it.
Yes.
The question is, why do you show Macedonia and not Bulgaria? So I think the better question is, where does Bulgaria stand here in this triangle?
Well, we wanted to characterize and to use as examples few countries. Bulgaria now is somewhere around the patronal democracy, where in the case of patronal democracies, any of the patron client networks which got into power, they try to transform themselves into patronal autocracies. There are two major institutional constraints what hampers normally these efforts. One is the first institutional guarantee, I would say, for this that. This is the proportional election system, which does not let any of the single political actors to reach a supermajority within the parliament, with which they alone as a single actor can change the constitution, and they can appoint to be the heads of all institutions their clients, which should serve as a normal circumstance, as a balancing between the different branches of power. This is one thing, and the other is such a constraint is the divided executive power, where normally a directly elected president and the prime minister both of them has some real power, and therefore these are those institutional constraints which hamper to be transformed into a patronal autocracy. In the case of Hungary and Russia, these constraints did not work. In the history, they were transformed. But for the patronal countries belonging to the patronal democracies, there is a cyclical character of their trajectories. We will see that around the end of this presentation, and with the help of a 3D model, which means that there are always an inherent wish and a trial to transform themselves into a patronal autocracy, but sometimes, but in most of the cases, it's not happening. But as these democratic breakthroughs, if they are not accompanied with anti-patronal transformation, then the patronal democracy always produces the ground for new and new patron client networks to try to transform the regime into a patronal autocracy. But to understand this, it is important for us to understand that, to have a look at that, what we call patronal character, and it has 4 dimensions of it. In the dimensions of institutions, when the formal institutions are replaced by informal ones. In a patronal autocracy, where the informal institutions are the dominant one and the formal institutions are subordinated to them, and the formal institutions are operated as transmission belt organizations of a single pyramid patronal network, it means that the decision-making, the real decision-making, not the formal one, but the de facto decision-making, is taken out from the formal institutions into informal bodies, what we should call the chief patron's court, which are not formal bodies. On the level of regulations, when the normative regulations are replaced by discretional regulations, when the authorization for government actions and any state actions is normally not a collective or corporate decision, but a personal one. And when in a society, the bureaucratic and institutional chains of command and dependencies are replaced by clientelist and personal chains and dependencies. It does not mean, of course, that there are no formal institutions, normative regulations, etc. But it means that the dominant form and what determines the real character of the given regime is a patronal one. This is the base on which we can make a real difference, for example, between two autocratic attempts, the Polish one and the Hungarian one. The Hungarian system is a Petrol autocracy, while the Polish one is a conservative autocracy, where those who are in Poland, for example, those who are making the decisions, they are all embedded in formal institutions. Namely, the leading force is really the PiS and not an informal body around Kaczynski, but those who has real political power. They are members of the leadership of the right-wing ruling party of Poland. In Poland, the economy is not vesselized and not transformed into patron-client relations like in Hungary. Poland is an ideology-led system, this conservative system, ideology-driven system, while Orbán's regime in Hungary is an ideology-applying system. And we could follow all these differences, which makes a difference between the Polish and the Hungarian one. But I will speak about this later, showing them this 3D model. Now, if we go further, then you can see that that language, what we try to create, is somehow a kind of successor. That language which is used partly by Max Weber, Karl Polanyi, and their followers. And there are, in the literature, not in the mainstream literature, but in another branch, not in the literature of hybridology or transitology, there is another branch of this literature which is somehow follower of these intellectual transitions. And there are a lot of names of these of the states when they want to characterize these states. But what happens is practically is that these namings just refer to one or another dimension of the state and does not try to describe them in their complexity. Therefore, we had to make a difference between four dimensions. The question is that who is the actor? This is the basic question. Who is the actor? And we see that in the case of what we call clan state, it's sometimes they use the name informal state, informal network state, if they are informal bodies. If this informal network state has a hierarchy, then they use sometimes the patronal state. But if this patronal state can be described as a clan, as an adopted family, and we call the ruling elite of these patronal autocracies adopted political families, then we can call it as a clan state, because it means that the ruling elite has a structure of the extended patriarchal family of a clan, where those who do not are the members who are not the members of this family with on a real kinship base, their relation, if they join or they are adopted to this family, they are transformed into a quasi-kinship relation. This is a clan. But if we try to describe that action when the state organizations and the state power is expropriated, then we can speak about patrimonial or neo-patrimonial state. When the state bureaucracy is expropriated and used directly for private gains. The difference between the classical patrimonial and neo-patrimonial, that in the case of neo-patrimonial, there is a facade of democratic institutions, while on the other hand, the real operation is ruled by a clan which expropriates the rights of the state. If we look at the third dimension, that what happens with the public goods, then we can speak about either for rent-seeking states, then in the next phase, kleptocratic states. But in the case of kleptocracy, it's directed for incomes and revenues of the state, diverting into private pockets these incomes and revenues. But peaceful cheating, I would say, and the third phase of the predatory state, when it means that not only incomes are diverted, but there is a predational process where even properties of private owners are taken away with the help of state coercion. And if we consider the fourth dimension, the legality of this state, we can speak about corrupt state when there are some corruption of certain elements, certain persons in this state. In a second phase, captured state, when this corruption is not occasional but more or less systemic, but the capture is a bottom-up, has a bottom-up direction, and it does not affect the whole state. And the third phase is criminal state, when a political organization acts as a criminal organization, a political enterprise captures the whole state, and the executive power and the governance is operated like a criminal organization. If those four dimensions characterize a state, then we can speak about mafia state. And this is what we call post-communist mafia state. We just investigated the post-communist regimes. And within the EU, Hungary is the only mafia state which fulfills these criteria. But beyond the EU, Russia, Central Asian countries, they are mafia states in this model as well. Now let's turn to the economic side of this, and we had to confront our notions with the major statements of neoclassical synthesis, and we just summarized briefly that what are the major challenges concerning the neoclassical synthesis of the economy, or from one of these axioms which was dissolved, that namely that the economic actors just follow the principle of rational choice, is the behavioral economics. Another axiom which was abandoned and dissolved, that the system of supply and demand just without any limits can operate, and facing this problem, institutional economics emerged, which emphasized the different formal and informal forms of institutions which can correct these axioms and to put another basis these economic investigations. The third one, what we call relational economics, it means that that we think that when the state has some features of corruption or deviances, it can happen that it's not just a accompanying feature of the state, but it can happen if the state is operated like a criminal organization ruled by an adopted political family, then the whole economy is dominated by these patron-client networks, and in this case, the classic rules of Western economy, Western market economy, could not be applied for the description of these societies. And therefore, we made a typology of different levels and different stages of corruption. And you see that we separated 6 such types, starting with free market corruption, and then cronyism, state organized collusion, bottom-up state capture, top-down state capture, and the criminal state. And this is, we can describe it on an axis from petty corruption to grand corruption, but it shows at the same time that corrupt actions, which in a free market corruption and petty corruption, they are managed on a voluntary basis on the level of top-down state capture or criminal state patterns. They are correct, coercive ones. in the case of petty corruption, they are normally non-centralized, while they are totally centralized in a criminal state. And while that corruption, free market corruption, is a competitive one, in the case of a criminal state, it's monopolistic one. Like in a classic mafia, it's a monopolistic one, but just the coercion which is exercised by a classic mafia with direct physical, in a lot of cases by the means of direct physical coercion. This is replaced in a criminal state with the non-bloody ways of state coercion through the domesticated jurisdiction, so the domesticated chief attorney's office and parliament. And in a criminal state, you have permanent and general vessel chains which describe this society. As a result of this, when we spoke, or I spoke about the criminal state and one dimension of the criminal state, that it's a predatory state. It means that, for example, rejderstwo, corporate trading in such a system, in a criminal state, it can be tied not to the so-called organized underworld or to criminal groups, but to the so-called organized upper world, which is on the level of the chief patron, on the level of top-level authority, while it's a kind of wide rating, normally lacking the means of physical coercion, but of course there are a lot of blackmail and coercion by the criminal state, and we can speak about this corporate trading on the state level, organized on the state level, as when you have a criminal state, and in the normal case, I would say in quotation mark, of course, single pyramid network, which is monopolized. In this case, not oligarchs capture the state, but the state captures the oligarchs and the market. And this is, for example, the turn what happened in Russia in 2003, when Putin gained a constitutional majority in the parliament as well, managed to have that, and at the same time, he captured the oligarchs, or this capture means they had to, some of them, to flee the country, or to they were put in jail like Khodorkovsky. This way that the state is behaving like a private predator, of course, it transforms the normal way of operation of economy as well. And what happens in this case, it could not be described with the classic categories of supply and demand, but much more as a process of predation. And this process has three phases: the stalking phase, the hunting phase, and the consuming phase. The stalking phase is when members, oligarchs of the adopted political family around the chief patron, they try to look around and to choose such enterprises which could be the target of predation. And they try to calculate, and this is why I write the value of unmolested value. We call that value which would be the normal market value of a company if it would not be a target of state harassment. But if it's a target of state harassment, then of course its value can be diminished when they hunt it down. This is the hunting phase. But of course, before it, they have to see that what could be the forecasted value of this prey, and it depends on the amplitude of arbitrariness what a criminal state can exercise, namely whether they are able to change, for example, the regulations which apply for an investment, or they can generate EU funds to support that investment, or generate other forms of governmental help for that investment or enterprise. So then comes the hunting phase, which is practically the blackmailing and destroying the positions of that company. And then when the hunting phase is finished and is seized, then comes the consuming phase, when the relational value of the company will be equal with its booty value, and when they seize the prey. But in the case of patron autocracies, it's not a simple deviancy, but a widespread activity of this criminal state, the predatory state, and they this way rearrange the ownership relations within their regimes and transform the originally autonomous entrepreneurs into a kind of agglomerate of dependent, vassalized clients. This means that when we try to build on the dominant integration schemes described, for example, by Karl Polanyi, when he makes a differentiation between market coordination, redistributive coordination, and redistribution, and reciprocity. Now we won't speak about reciprocity. We have to make a difference within the redistribution, and to see that while in a classic planned economy, in a command economy in the previous communist systems, there was a bureaucratic resource redistribution, what was formalized, impersonal, normative, and general. Now, in a patronal autocracy, what is characterized mainly and dominated by relational economy, there is a relational market redistribution, what is non-formalized, personal, discretional, and at the same time not simply totalitarian or general, but dominant. And while the invisible hand of the impersonal market forces in a capitalist system, in a communist system, was replaced by the central planning of the nomenclatura, bypassing market forces in a relational economy where the economy is not bureaucratically embedded, using the term of Polanyi, embedded economy, but patronally embedded. Then the visible hand of the patron is interfering with the market forces. Now let's turn very shortly to the questions of ideology, and I would like to give a definition for this, that populism, what is the basic, in quotation mark, ideology of these patronal autocracies, it's nothing else, according to the definition, as an ideological instrument for the political program of a morally unconstrained collective egoism. And all of these components of these definitions has very important meaning, which means that the populism, according to us, is not an ideology, but an ideological instrument, which means that you can make a difference between ideology-driven regimes and ideology-applying one. As I mentioned before, ideology, for example, the difference between Kaczynski's autocratic attempt and Orbán's autocratic attempt, that Kaczynski's autocratic attempt as a main rule is an ideology-driven regime, which means that this ideology, what he represents as a value coherence, and ideology-driven means that he is ready to pay the price of being value coherent, even if it's not popular. It's enough to think of his fights, for example, against abortion, which is not popular at all, but in spite of this, he strives to have more and more restrictions in this aspect. While in ideology applying regimes, there is no value coherence between those ideological panels which are used by the chief patron, but there is a functionality coherence. Functionality coherence means that he applies such kind of ideological panel what he thinks that politically is payable, lucrative for him. So, for example, Orban can, on the same day, to meet Arab entrepreneurs, having mutual business with his family, and speaking them about the very importance of Islam culture, what we have to learn a lot from that. And in the afternoon, having hate campaigns against the Muslim migrants who are threatening the Christian culture of Hungary, etc. So this is the first moment. The political program in this definition means that populism mainly is against, it's a challenge toward the legal rational legitimacy of this regime and trying to transfer it into a substantive rational legitimacy, which means that the substantive political goals of a regime, they override the legal system. And therefore, I think it's very important that populism not means simply demagogy or anti-elitism or other such things, because there can be a lot of demagogic or even extremist ideology or even different types of ideological patterns and values which do not challenge the process of public deliberation of the liberal democracies. Morally unconstrained collective egoism, and this is together is very important, which means that this is where the supply side and the demand side of this populism can be separated, because the ideological instrument, the political program, is the supply side. The demand side is morally unconstrained collective egoism. These represent those people, those different strata or within the society who are receptive for these things, because they feel sometimes threatened, or they feel themselves depreciated, or they feel themselves in an unstable situation, and these populist ideology panels of ideology somehow frees them from the burden to show solidarity with the vulnerable part of the society, and just helps them to put them into the position of victims, and as such a way to raise to take away, to free them from the responsibility of being solidary with different underdog parts of this society. So this is what we think about populism, and where now I turn to that what I meant, that what is the difference between an ideology-driven regime and an ideology-applying one, where the ideologies does not have a value coherence. And while I do not want to tell it again, value coherence, ideologically consistent in an ideology-driven regime, while functionality coherence, ideologically inconsistent. Therefore, I think it's a very poor performance of the intellectuals when they try to point the inconsistency of the ideology, what, for example, Orban or Putin or other populists represent, because when they are speaking about inconsistency, they assume that populism has a value coherence and not functionality coherence. I think functionally it's not inconsistent at all. While the ideology-driven regime has an ideological determination, the other one has an utilitarian determination. And what is important, that while an ideology regime basic propaganda is based on hate actions, hate campaigns, and then on the other side, the ideology applying regimes built on fear campaigns, which means that their primary goal is not to raise hate against certain groups, but to raise fears in their potential voters against, with the help of certain groups, and to create a situation where they can, these social strata can put themselves into the position that the chief patron is the only guy who can protect them. Therefore, I think that we can make a kind of typology concerning the so-called political economy of stigmatization, and it has three major dimensions. One is that what are the dimensions of separating them from us, and theoretically it can have ethnicity, religion, language, sexual orientation, cultural tradition, social status, etc. But of course, the different social groups do not fulfill all these requirements. Why is it the most profitable to fight against refugees? Because in most of the cases they are ethnically, concerning their religion, concerning their language, their cultural tradition, and even social status are different from the mainstream in the given society. So therefore, it's very easy to build up that ideological architecture, that we have to be afraid of them, and we will be defended from them by the chief patron. And of course, this is in connection with the potential fear-generating potential, the possible fear-generating potential of these groups. While, for example, Orban had campaigns in 2011, just a year after, when he had a supermajority in the parliament, against liberal intellectuals, liberal philosophers in Hungary. But of course, the fear-generating potential of liberal philosophers is really not high. So it's much more profitable politically for a populist to raise fear against refugees. And the third major dimension is that what is the capacity of these different attacked social groups for voice against the attacks of the state. And again, refugees are those who, even when they do not can cross the border, they cannot defend and cannot speak up in favor of their interests. So, and in the last column, you can see that what are those ideological panels which are tied to can be tied to different groups. So I think there is not a value coherence of these regimes, and therefore it's a wrong way, or it's very misleading when part of liberal intellectuals try to call these, for example, the Hungarian regime a fascist regime. It's not a fascist regime. It uses some of such ideological panels, what are used by, of course, different even fascist regimes or Nazi regimes, or some theocratic regimes, or some other kind of autocratic regimes in the world. But it does not fulfill the criterion of being fascist regimes. They are not that. They are, I call them post-communist mafia states. Now, finally, if you consider this, that let's see what kind of trajectories we have for post-communist regimes. Historically, we had a luck that the whole communist system collapsed in one time concerning the Soviet Empire, which made it very interesting that to compare these different trajectories where they started from the same point, from being a communist dictatorship, even if, of course, they were soft and hard communist dictatorships. There were bureaucratic ones, or built much more on legal, rational rule. The others were more characterized as patrimonial one. But anyway, they were communist dictatorship, which meant that they had one-party system and the monopoly of communist power. And now with these trajectories, we differentiated the second level, which is tied to the notion of petrol or non-petrol character of these regimes. So those regimes, one trajectory among these primary trajectories, one when, for example, Estonia, Poland, and Hungary in the 90s, early 90s, when they became from a communist dictatorship liberal democracy, where a single pyramid bureaucratic petrol regime was transformed into a multi-pyramid non-petrol. But of course, you can see that the second typical trajectory from a communist dictatorship went directly to petrol democracy. In the case of such countries like Romania, Ukraine, they never reached the status of being liberal democracies, where a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal regime was transformed into a multi-pyramid informal patronal regime. And the last one, not the last, the third one, from a communist dictatorship, practically within a very few years, or even directly, was evolved a patronal autocracy, went from a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal regime, became a single pyramid informal patronal regime, and where there was just a model change in the case of China, where communist dictatorship was transformed into a market exploiting dictatorship, and the single pyramid bureaucratic patronal regime remained a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal regime. Now, of course, it's not the last and terminal station of some of these countries, and we can see what is the situation in the case of so-called secondary trajectories. And there we can, one of the model type is Poland, for example, which is going towards a conservative autocracy after 2015, from a multi-pyramid non-patronal regime towards, as I emphasized, a single pyramid non-patronal regime. But of course, on the political level, it's going from a liberal democracy towards a conservative autocracy. It can happen, what happened after 2013 in the Czech Republic, that from a liberal democracy, it goes towards patronal democracy, and it happened in Hungary in the first step until 2010, from a multi-pyramid non-patronal regime towards a multi-pyramid informal patronal regime. And of course, there are other, like in the case of Hungary, when it's from a multi-pyramid non-patronal regime, it becomes a single pyramid informal patronal autocracy as well. And there is a regime change also when Russia, from a multi-pyramid informal patronal regime, which was never a liberal democracy, became a single pyramid informal regime. So in the case of these two levels of these regime dynamics and cycles, you can see that we can investigate it from democratic transformation and anti-democratic transformation as an axis, and anti-patronal transformation and patronal transformation on the other side. The mainstream politology describing these regimes just concentrates on the democracy dictatorship axis and not on the axis of anti-patronal or non-patronal to patronal ones. And now I try to go to the this 3D model. I hope I will be successful to share it with you what we developed, and it's available. You can see it now. Can you see it now? Yes. So it's a 3D model describing these countries, and it has different levels of description on which one, and we will try to describe these regimes. But on the first level, you see that just the general status of these, just showing these three of these six regime types, at all of which you can see a definition also, and a short description. These one, but now you can see. Let us say now the case of Russia, where it went, and we can start to show their way, this way, what happened with Russia, which describes that how it became and went towards a patronal democracy, never reaching it, and became a patronal autocracy, and we can compare it, let us say, with other countries. Let's take Hungary, which first went became a liberal democracy, and later now again after 2010 it became a patronal autocracy, and even in a harder patronal autocracy. Or you can take in this picture China, which went to a market exploiting dictatorship, and since 2012 a little bit further back into the direction of a communist dictatorship. But now let me just take out China and Russia, and put Poland into the picture. You see that Poland is going on this way. Now, what happens if we do not make this double level of analysis, political institutions and the non-patronal character of this society and for the whole system? Then if we, excuse me, well, it's difficult to go back, yes. One moment. Yes, if we take out the trajectories and the namings, and if you see here, then if it, well, yes, and this is the if you put it on the axis, on an axis, then it would show that Poland and Hungary is very close to each other. If we would use just the mainstream politological analysis, then it says that from liberal democracy we are going towards a dictatorship, and well, Poland is a little bit behind us, but we are very close to each other. But if we introduce this patronal character, then we see that there are huge differences in the different type of autocracies. And if we go onto different model types now with the description, let us say, with the classical one of the classical politological approach, which makes a difference between liberal democracy, electoral democracy, competitive autocracy, hegemonic autocracy, and closed autocracies, then you see that Poland is a competitive autocracy still. Hungary is much more a hegemonic one, but of course, even within a hegemonic autocracy or a competitive autocracy, you can have a lot of difference. And I won't go all of these characteristics. There are a lot of them, but for example, the ruling party's function. Let's take one. The PiS in Poland is a governing party. The decisions are made there. In Hungary, the Fidesz is a transmission party. If we look at the dominant economic integrative mechanism, then it's a competitive market in Poland, while the dominant one in Hungary is a relational market. There, the dominant property form is a private property. In Hungary, the dominant one is the so-called power ownership, which means that there is no power without ownership, there is no ownership without power. If we speak about the corruption, then we see that the corruption in Poland is still a system destroying, has a system destroying character, where the government fights corruption, even if there are some corruption cases, of course. But in Hungary, in the case of Hungary and Russia and all those who belong to the Petrol autocracies, the corruption is not a deviance, it's a system constituting corruption, what we can see in these regimes. And if we again, about the ideology, then it's ideology neutral driven now. Poland is going as a conservative autocracy towards the ideology driven side, while in Hungary, it's an ideology applying regimes. And if we now try to look at all these characters together, you see, then we try to create a consistency when we describe these trajectories. Then in a certain moment, the given countries should be in the same point of these triangles, and we try to create a coherency over these different dimensions, and not using just one naming for this or that regime, which should describe only one or another element, but otherwise would be not usable for other characteristics of a given regime. So thank you very much. I apologize that I was so long and I could not make it in a shortened time, but the book is 800 pages. Now it was published in English and in Hungarian. Next year it's coming out in Russian, in Moscow, in Spanish and in Romanian. And by the CEU Press and the Hungarian Publishing House, we were asked to write a brief version of it, which will be called a concise field guide to post-communist regimes, and it will be published around the middle of the next year. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Bálint. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Actually, I know that we passed the time limit, but I didn't want to, because I was learning a lot here. You showed lots of characteristics, governance characteristics, political characteristics, societal characteristics, and it's fascinating to see that that you as an expert know the characteristics of these countries, and you analyze them over years since 2-3 decades ago. And I mean, I'm still impressed, and I want to know more. I will definitely get the book and read the book. And there are lots of questions from the audience. 2 of them are already inserted here. So maybe first I go to Slavo, who would unmute himself and ask the question. Thank you, Slavo, for your question, and please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to both Bálints. First, a compliment. I think your book is, I think, paradigmatic change. I think you have put finally the last nail in the coffin of the economics of transition. That's my kind of private opinion. I have 2 questions. First is how your concept of relational economy, which is quite important in your context, relates to I'm guessing you are familiar with the Nolke and others' book on state-permeated large economies, which I would put also in the box of relational economy, although then they make distinction with the dependent market economies. Could you comment where you see them in relation to your perspective? And my second question, to use this opportunity, is could kind of combination of communist market dictatorship really develop innovation-based economy, or this story that you are pointing to post-communist system, that eventually they may reach some limit in terms of what can be done with that model of development?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I would start that when we dissolve some axioms, then we knew that there are other such axioms what we did not touch, what should be touched if we would expand our model not only for the post-communist regimes. Such an axiom that, for example, in our analysis, we assumed that there are no failed states in the regime, as practically, with the exception of mid-90s in Russia or in Ukraine, where they were on the edge of becoming failed states, but practically during the transformation, all the post-communist states were capable to act. The question is that in favor of whom and for favor of what. So this is one such thing. The other thing, what we did not dissolve as an axiom, that the formal cover of holding the power in these societies are political parties, while of course there are such other autocratic regimes like theocratic regimes where these are not political parties, or military juntas and regimes where these are not political parties. So if we want to expand our model, that's it. When trying to answer your questions, of course, these elements, what we use for building a new architecture, these are not brand new ones. So there are such categories, what we use as the mainstream and general understanding of a given category. We choose other categories to which we gave a restricted use, and there are in the third box brand new categories. For example, in the restricted categories that some of people are, or a lot of people are speaking, for example, when they try to analyze these corrupt regimes, they are speaking about, let us say, crony capitalism. And they do not face the problem that when they are speaking cronies, it assumes equal position in a corruption transaction, does not implies a permanent patron-client character of such relations. Of course, there are systems where the holders of the powers has cronies with which they are making not regular and not stabilized, not such corruption actions which would create permanent patron-client relations. This is why I use this just as an example that, for example, the crony, we use it in a constrained use. In a second such a category, for example, the rent-seeking state. And they sometimes say that rent-seeking state, this category would cover all types of corruption. What we do not think, we think that rent-seeking can be even a legal type of governance. Of course, I can agree with that or not, but rent-seeking can. But I expand the sphere of state enterprises, and I put my client, I put my party favorites in those positions. In this respect, it can be a rent-seeking regime, but it's not necessarily a kleptocratic one. And the kleptocratic regime is not necessarily a predatory regime. And we wanted to create, for example, on this axis, a hierarchy within these categories. So, of course, any such approach which tries to describe the operation of a state not serving definitely or totally public interests, of course, they have different a sense of truth, but we wanted to make a kind of organized system and architecture among these categories. So this is why I think that, of course, our description can be related to a lot of other works. What we try to do is to have a whole architecture of these categories.
Okay, thank you, Bálint. And if there's no more question from Slavo, which he inserted one comment here.
No, I could have a long discussion.
Yes.
I asked second about these limits of this type of regimes in relation to innovation-based growth, because there is this idea, conventional, oh, there are limits to what China can do. Eventually, when it comes to innovation-driven growth, there has to be creativity, freedom, democracy.
Yes, it's a real question. I think I grew up in the illusion, that without political freedom, you cannot have economic development for a long time. And now I think it somehow is questioned, because in the case of China, you can see even with different cycles, strong economic development without political freedom. For us now, if I do not consider myself now as a sociologist, but just a human being, the question is that okay, even if you have such economic development, whether it's first to live in such a society where there is no freedom. So it's not just a question of efficiency, because it can happen that those systems in their logic, to some extent, can be much more efficient than the classic communist regimes in which we were raised.
Well, Bálint, talking about economic and prosperity, so what kind of regime that in those characteristics that you defined and showed, what kind of them gives us better prosperity? Because you also showed, I think the graph that you were showing, it had the vertical axis of market value, and I think the market value was the public enterprise value, right?
Yes, not all. You see, those regimes which belong to the patron autocracies, I think they are not so prosperous than even those who belong to the patron democracies. The relative position of Hungary, for example, compared with Slovakia, Romania, and even Bulgaria, is worsening. So our lead in relation to Romania especially practically disappeared. Now GDP per capita, they are somewhere on our level. Slovakia, which was close to us now, is much ahead of us. So I would say that that type of regime, what we have, this patron autocracy, is much less competitive as a regime in the international market. But it does not mean that these regimes could not be stabilized and could not reach stable positions, because as a patron autocracy, I think that most of the Central Asian regimes, or even Russia, is stable, because stability does not mean that in a normal democracy, the ruling elite would not be replaced by a democratic leadership. But it shows that, for example, in the case of Russia, they ensured the equilibrium, the social equilibrium, or with physical suppression and other non-economic, with a lot of non-economic means, what they can provide. In the case of Hungary, of course, that our EU membership means a real constraint to use direct physical coercion, but therefore the different sophisticated ways of blackmailing and state coercion, of course, exist in this society. And I cannot say that it could not be, that this regime could not stabilize itself. The real problem is when we have to face whether these regimes could be changed, that in a patron autocracy, as they are criminal states, not only on a moral base, but practically the leaders are criminals according to the existing criminal code. For them, the stake of an election is not just that whether until now they were in a governing position and after it they will get into an opposition position within the parliament, a non-governmental position, but it's the question whether you have a superpower on one hand or you will be treated as a criminal and put in jail. So when the autocratic attempts failed, for example, in Ukraine, North Macedonia, or Moldova, there the chief patrons had to flee just to save their personal liberty. This is the real question for Orbán as well. He is afraid very much that if he loses power, then partly he himself and his so-called patronal court, chief patron's court, they will be under the authority of criminal procedures, and they could end in prison. It means that therefore here the elections in these regimes, it's really a fight for life and death, life or death, you know, and they're not simple elections like in Western societies.
I see. Very elaborate answer. Actually, I had more questions, but let's go to the questions from the audience. So there was one question by Andreas, and he asks, so what kind of developments would be necessary to bring countries like Poland or Hungary back, or at least closer to the category of liberal democracy?
Well, I think that in the case of Poland, the chances are much better than in the case of Hungary. You know, so in Poland, the PiS still do not have a constitutional supermajority. They could not rewrite the constitution. There they have a challenging moderate right-wing party, which is very important. What we lacked for a long time in Hungary. There, the election system is a proportionate one, and therefore it's not necessary even for the chance of winning to join for the opposition parties before the elections, what was necessary in Hungary. There, the entrepreneurs are not transferred into patron-client networks, so therefore the entrepreneurial support of opposition forces can be much stronger, etc. So the local governments and those autonomy of local governments is bigger than in Hungary, etc. So therefore, I see that the chances in Poland are better for democratic breakthrough again, and it should not be necessary to be accompanied for anti-patronal transformation, because Poland was not vassalized, the Polish society, it was not patronalized during this Kaczynski's effect. In the case of Hungary, it's a very difficult question. In all of these aspects, what I listed, in Hungary, the situation is much worse.
Mm-hmm. So you showed these graphs. Are they based on some rankings or numbers? For instance, if Poland is shown closer to liberal democracy, is there a number that you set here?
No, these were done such a way that we brought together for each country some experts. We spoke with them, having little seminars with them, and tried to ask them, and we made it together to put them in this or that box of these triangles. This is, on the other hand, I think that I am more or less skeptic towards the rankings, the different type of rankings, you know. For example, when there is a ranking for corruption, for example, in a patronal autocracy like Hungary, the traditional forms of corruption, against the traditional forms of corruption, the government fights, because he fights only against the unauthorized corruption and against that corruption which is not organized and carried out by themselves, like in a normal mafia. You know, it's this is his territory. There is no free market. He does not want to tolerate the free market corruption. So when they say that the traditional forms of corruption are declining in Hungary, then this, for example, the different corruption scores cannot even grasp the phenomenon of the criminal state. They, for example, how these corruption scores are created. Sometimes they are making interviews mainly with foreign investors, whether they had to bribe any government officials or not to have a state procurement, etc. But in Hungary, it's not the case. It's not a free market corruption when you can bribe anybody and to give more kickback money to certain officials. No, it's directed from above. For example, the officials who can decide, let us say, at the local government about these investments and EU monies, EU funds, they can retain their position, but they are not paid directly by an investor. The investments and the potential circle of investors and entrepreneurs, not oligarchs, is appointed from above and decided that who can win, what can win, and it's not the case of classic corruption. Therefore, when they are coming, for example, and it's happened several times that the EU officials came to Hungary trying to teach Hungarian government people how to fight against corruption. This is something like then if you want to teach a lion how to be a vegetarian, you know. So it had no sense at all. These were ridiculous efforts. Now the EU realizes somehow that they have to keep back the taxpayers' money and not to give directly to mafia-like organizations, especially if they rule a country, because what is the financial base of autocracy in Russia, for example, the natural resources. For our autocracy, for our Hungarian autocracy, is the natural resources nothing else than the EU funds, you know, which are coming and they can distribute and stabilize their single pyramid patronal network.
I understand the complexity, so let me go to the question and then pick up some of the questions that I see here. So and then I will ask more questions. So Gudrun, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, or?
Yes, with pleasure. First of all, I would like to thank for the presentation, and it's made the difference between Poland and Hungary much clearer for me. And I agree that probably just a change of the government will not be sufficient to dismantle the system which is in place. That is very interesting. But as a former diplomat who spent many years in countries in transformation, including Russia, Bulgaria, former Yugoslav republics, I saw, and I actually still see, a lot of collusion and influence of be it politicians, be it business. Sometimes there's a very close combination of both in the countries of transformation. What role does this play in the transformation process? Did it play in the transformation process, and what role may it play even until today?
Well, I think that in a lot of other countries like Romania and in Bulgaria or even Slovakia would be such a mafia state what we have in Hungary, or in what we have in Hungary, if they would have such a disproportionate election system what we have. Because in that case, any of the political actors, and in the case of Romania, they could be right-wing or left-wing, it doesn't matter. I think that they would evolve and create the same type of single pyramid patronal network if they would have the possibility alone to change the constitution and to and to fight against the separation of branches of power in their governments. So these systems, of course, they are very much tied to this unstable position within the type of patronal democracies. It's the first step, I think, what is needed just to understand the character of these societies and this, what does it mean, these patronal networks, or how do they operate, and how to fight against this and to create a patronal transformation. I think for example, in the those post-communist countries which belong to the Orthodox Christianity, the only such country was Georgia, which was more or less for a while successful in this anti-patronal transformation and could break out of the, in quotation mark, normal cyclical character of patronal democracies for a while. And the other case, Hungary is the only one within those who belong to the Western Christian civilization, who transformed themselves into a patronal autocracy, which characterizes most of those who are like Russia or like Central Asian countries. So it's a very difficult thing, I think, to understand the operation of these countries. But what I told about previously about the importance for such an election system which is proportionate. When my first book about the Hungarian Mafia State was published in Bulgaria, and I was there on a book launch at that time, just was a huge discussion about the proportionate election system, and they wanted to change it for a majoritarian one. And I tried to make them to understand, I had some interviews there, that it would be a deadly step and it would lead very quickly towards such a mafia state what we have. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding when people are speaking about mafia state. They think that mafiosos or mafioso type oligarchs, they are capturing the state. When I'm speaking about mafia state, it's not the case, because these are captured states. It's, of course, when the organized underworld or some oligarchs try to capture this or that part of the executive branches, executive powers within a state. What I call mafia state when a political enterprise operates the state as a criminal organization and captures the oligarchs themselves and captures the market. Now, this could not happen within such a system where you have competing, rivaling patron-client networks, you know, and these patron-client networks, each of them is interested somehow to have guarantees that the other does not try to destroy them. But of course, they themselves, when they are in a governing position, they try to monopolize their position. Therefore, it creates a cyclical character of this regime dynamics. Henry Hale, for example, from the George Washington University, in his book about patronal politics, he wrote a lot about this.
Thank you, Bálint, for great explanation. If Gudrun's questions are finished, because she posed some other questions as well.
Yes, the role of the interaction of the, you call them liberal democracies, whether more or less corrupt, but with these transformation processes which took place, including in Hungary. I think there is, despite all the criticism from Germany, there is a lot of collusion and cooperation and influence as well.
Influence between whom and whom you think?
Yes, politicians, business. Of
course, but for example, this is also misleading when people are speaking corruption, that, for example, liberal democracies, there are corruption as well. They are mainly tied to the problem of party financing. And in these corrupt actions, let us say what happened in Germany, in France, in the United States, or Britain, or any other liberal democracies, it means that the politician remained in his role as a politician and an entrepreneur in his role as an entrepreneur. The politician made a favor maybe for this or that entrepreneur, how to have some advantages in his entrepreneurial behavior, while the politician did not want to be transformed himself into an entrepreneur. In our categorization, therefore, in most of these post-communist regimes, like Hungary, and not only patronal autocracies, but to some extent in patronal democracies as well, we are speaking about oligarchs and oligarchs. Oligarchs, I mean, those guys who has an open, a visible political power and an invisible economic one, power and fortune. And just the contrary, an oligarch who has a visible economic power and an invisible, has an oligarch who has a visible economic power and wealth and an invisible political one. And this is when we speak that and when we write about that, but just following some Russian experts in their categorization, Andrei Ryabov or Nureyev in Russia, who are speaking about power and ownership, vlast-sobstvenost, just as a single category, which describes that you cannot have power without ownership, you cannot have ownership without power. And it's not the case in liberal democracies. It's a very clear difference, and we cannot wash these two things together just with the fact that, okay, there is corruption there as well, and there is corruption here. These are absolutely different type of corrupt relations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting, because my main question was how corruption is defined. Is it something relative? Is there any benchmark to measure corruption, or?
Benchmark, when you saw that table, what you can see when you share the presentation, when it's categorized the different forms of corruption. And then they say that, as I mentioned, that at the two ends of this axis, there is the free market corruption on one end of the axis, and on the other end, the criminal state. These are absolutely different level and types of corruption. For the EU, of course, it's very difficult when they have to negotiate with Orban, and I understand this diplomatic problem for them, that when you have to negotiate with a criminal, because he is a criminal, not because of my moral judgment, but because of according to the Hungarian law. And when we are speaking about mafia state, of course it shows that why it is not neo-feudalism, because they used to say, because feudal system was a legitimate system, where patron client systems were legitimized, and it was there the de facto and de jure position was the same. A landlord did not have to transfer formally the right of the ownership of his land to his client, because he was legally the landlord. In the case of Orban, he is the richest man in Hungary, but you have a front man, Mr. Mészáros, who had in 2010 less than $100,000 wealth, and now he has close to $1.5 billion wealth on paper. But practically, he cannot dispose over this property. Only a small share of this, what is really his one. When we have to detect this, it's very difficult. We just, with my young friend with whom we wrote the book, we not just wrote an article, it will be published, I think, soon in the next year, when we call it the moment of truth, when we want to detect that really who owns this or that enterprise and to what extent. And these moment of truth is, for example, the death formally of an entrepreneur, and then in the next day it became clear that the formal inherit only a very small share of it, because practically large part of his wealth belonged to others, but it was not clear before. Or another moment of truth are the divorces, you know, when Bill Gates or Jeff other such big IT guys divorced, then their wives got practically the half of their fortune. Now, if there is a divorce in Hungary, what happened with, in the case of Mészáros, her wife got only a peanut from his more than $1 billion euro wealth, what meant that she is not a real owner, and Mészáros is not a real owner. The real owner who can dispose over this fortune is Viktor Orbán, the prime minister, the chief patron. But it means at the same time the status that you have the role in this society of a frontman who is not the real owner of his property, it shows that it's a mafia state.
Well, thank you, Bálint, for this brave discussion about politics of Hungary. There are still some other questions that we try to answer. So one question is a technical question that asks, which tools are you using for this visualization that you showed at the end, the 3D one? So what is the tool that you built this visualization, 3D visualization at the end?
What do you mean that which tools?
So with what did you produce this one? It's, I mean, it's also a question for me, so that's why I thought it's a good question.
We had some friends in informatics, and they just produce this this model, which is I think relatively nice. You know, it can do everything. You know, and even what I did not show you that people can write in it, so it can be used for writing as well. That, for example, you say that. No, you don't think that these countries are in this point, but I think that they are here or there, and I make some other trajectories when I teach this, and you can save these writings and even abolish them if you do not want them. You know?
So the thing is, is there any value so that you know, we can get these values, then we can use them quantitatively in our economics analysis. For instance, if we want to see how much the...
Yes, quantitative is, as I mentioned, it's a very difficult question because there is a vicious circle. You use the categories of liberal democracies to describe, and market economy to describe these societies. Therefore, the data are gathered which reflect to this language use. And then the data itself, what you gather, collect, it determines the categories as well. So it's very difficult to get out from this. And therefore, if you, and the assumption of the data collecting is the assumption behind the collection is that the de jure status of an actor, enterprise, etc., coincides with the de facto one. When you separate this and you say that it's not the case, then you do not have direct indicators. You have maybe proxies when you can create different patterns of behavior, which should somehow indirectly prove that this guy about whom you are speaking, she is not a real entrepreneur, but an oligarch or a frontman of somebody. And this is what we are working on now, that what kind of proxies can be operated as indirect indicators for describing these things. And then I think these could be used for further investigations. The problem is that there is a drive within the academic world that you have to be comparative and a large base, you know, so you could move. And what data you have normally, most of the data what you have in politics that how many parties are there, whether there were elections, what kind of elections they have, it's a presidential system or not. These are all formal things, but does not say anything about that whether a party is a Petrol client network, imitating a party, or a Western type party, or other data. You have the GDP, all these things, but it does not say anything about the internal relations of the economy. And when you are trying to work with such a set of categories, then it's very difficult to dig down into the society, into the economy, somehow to find out that what are the real operation of these ones. And therefore, of course, you are in a unprivileged situation if you want to be comparative. Even in the case of post-communist regimes, you know, I was lucky that I grown up in a soft communist regime, then I spent some years in a liberal democracy, then in a Petrol democracy, now 10 years in a Petrol autocracy. For a sociologist, it's a luck. For a citizen, it's not definitely. But of course, you need the experience that you could imagine what happens. That I have to admit that what's happening in China or Central Asia it's very difficult even to imagine for us who had no such direct personal experience about those things. But I wanted to tell that when you share or make available this presentation, of course, you can make available my email address, and I'm ready to have contacts with anybody and going in further discussions or cooperation. So
Thank you very much, Bálint. I think there's only one more question that it's Tomasz, and he would like to unmute if it is possible to answer to this comment as well, and then
yes.
we will finish.
Yes, thank you, Bálint, very much for your impressive and interesting presentation. And I have an impression that this analysis concentrates on the internal factors of changes. And somewhere in 2010, I could see in Budapest the banner, "We are not a colony." So I'm not sure whether we are able to explain all the dynamics of changes in China, in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, when we do not take into account interactions with global interests, with global companies. And I have in mind that, for example, the discrepancy between fast-growing productivity in Central and Eastern European countries and slowly growing wages. Or, for example, peace in Poland gained the power with support of trade unions. And similarly in China, the ruling Communist Party is popular because it helps Chinese companies to compete with Western ones. So could you explain whether some external factors are taken into account in your analysis?
Yeah, yes, you are right. We had to make difference between three levels of analysis, and in our book we focused on the regime-specific features. But beyond this, there are country-specific features and policy-specific features. So, for example, of course, if we want to make a difference between Russia and Hungary, we can say that Hungary has no natural resources, Russia has. Hungary is not a center of a civilization, Russia is, yes. Hungary was in the last century not an empire, but Russia, yes, etc. Russia is a big country, Hungary is a small one, etc. But I think this is concerning the regime-specific features, we are very similar. This is like we can say that when we say that it's a Petrol autocracy, this is when I say for a creature that it's a dog. But of course, it can be a Chihuahua and a German Shepherd. But what we wanted to see that okay, there are huge differences between a Chihuahua and the German Shepherd, or the Bichon Havanese and the Danish dog. You know, there are huge differences, but these differences are less, in quotation mark, I say, genetically, structurally, than with a cat or with a lion, you know, because they are lion and they are far from the Chihuahua and the Danish dog. A cat from both of them is far from regime-specific features than these regimes from each other. And of course, these country-specific features can be what you mentioned, that whether a country is a member of the NATO or the EU, the other is not. Of course, it determines that what level of, for example, physical coercion can be used in that society and whatnot, etc. But this is where we make a difference between regime-specific and country-specific features. And in the case of policy-specific features, we can say that even there can be some countries belonging to the same regime type. They can be, let us say, patronal democracies. And one of them, because of policy issues, they are better acting than the other. And even it can be, it can create in the long run, even huge differences among them, why they should belong to the same regimes. You know, that let us say that Hungary and Romania, before the regime change, they both were communist regimes concerning that one-party system and dominant state ownership. But because of regime, because of policy-specific features, Hungary was a much more viable regime than the and more successful than the Romanian one. So of course we have to make a difference, but the problem is that if we do not have the right language to describe these phenomena of these countries, then nothing remains for us but the endless storytelling about these countries, where we have to tell the whole story without being able to put them into certain types and to let them to move in within there.
Thank you, Bálint, for great explanations and for your patience. Now it's about 1 hour and 50 minutes that we had this interesting webinar. It was a very good and pleasure for us, an honor for us that you had it was a lecture rather than a presentation of a seminar. So I am very grateful for your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. We managed to conclude the seminar series in international economics of this year, and I wish you good holidays and see you hopefully in the next year. Thank you, Bálint, again.
Thank you, Mahdi. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.